You've probably heard the mysterious words thrown around in the news about the conflicts in the Middle East: Sunni and Shia. Sunni and Shia are the two camps that make up global Islam. We're talking about 1.8 billion people, nearly a quarter of everyone on the planet. The world's fastest growing religion split in two all the way back in the 5th century, 900 years before the Protestant Reformation. And this split changed not only the foundation of Islam, but also affected geopolitics across the world, access to global resources, and international affairs forever. Now, this split did not start because of a disagreement about God or prayer or a religious teaching. No, it started because of a family feud. One disagreement that would later come to explain conflicts that we see today in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It explains the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the headlines that you see almost daily. But here's the catch: maybe their religious differences aren't the problem anymore. And in many ways, these peaceful people are actually the scapegoats for something much more nefarious happening behind the scenes. Today, we're breaking down the biggest family feud in history that may still be going on. And trust me, it's more simple than you think and way more important than you realize. So sit back, relax, and welcome to Religion Camp. What's up, people, and welcome back to Religion Camp. My name is Mark Gagnon, and thank you for joining me in my tent, where every single week we explore the most interesting, fascinating, controversial stories from around the world, from every religion through all time, always trying to unlock all of the secret teachings and know the fullness of what it is to understand the divine. As always, I'm joined by my dear friend Christos Papadopoulos, I think. Is that how you pronounce it? All right, whatever, Christos. Hey, we don't have time for all that, because today we're going into one of the most interesting and hotly contested, controversial religious disputes of all time. And that is the distinction of the Sunni and Shia divide in modern-day Islam. Now, for a few things, let me just start off by saying, one, I was not raised Muslim. I'm just a Catholic boy from Florida, okay? So, a few things on that. One, I'm going to get a lot of words wrong. Sorry, my Arabic pronunciation is not perfect, but I'm going to do my best. Secondly, I don't know all of the details and nuanced political nature of everything. I've done quite a bit of research to understand this topic, but if I get anything wrong, please feel free to write a comment. Let me know. Correct me. I can make an addendum in a later video. So if I get anything wrong or if I miss anything, please just let me know. I'm coming at this in good faith and trying to understand why this distinction exists and why and how it has affected the political landscape of our world today. Now, if you're listening to this as a, Western Christian like myself, you're probably familiar with religious schism, right? You have, the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox. You have Protestants and all the denominations in between. These are religious dogmatic distinctions that have occurred within the church throughout the years. And they all come from the same root, Christ himself. Yet they differ on some major points about what it means to be a follower of Christ. Some churches acknowledge others, some don't acknowledge other ones. And similarly, but a little less beknownst to Westerners, Islam had a major split happen early on in the organization of their faith, which ultimately divided the religion into two main factions. And these factions have not only stuck around for 1,400 years, but they still very much affect the world we live in today. Now, you probably heard of, these terms, Sunni and Shia. And maybe they're talking about the conflicts in Iraq or the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the reporter throws out like, Sunni Shia divide. Like it, just explains everything. And, my dumb ass is at home just like, yeah, that is a big divide. But deep down, I'm always just like, I don't understand what's going on. Now, here's the thing. Lots of people don't know what those words mean, let alone what the difference between them is. So let's break it down. Sunni and Shia are the names of two factions that Islam split into: Sunni Muslims and Shia, also known as Shiite Muslims, as sometimes Westerners will call it. Now, what is the difference? That is ultimately what we're going to be getting into today. Good news is that it's actually more simple than you might think, but also probably way more important than you originally thought. Now, here's what's wild about the whole thing. We're talking about 1.8 billion people, nearly a quarter of everyone on Earth. And to me, again, this just kind of goes into the greater reason why I even do this show in the first place, because I truly have a passion and a desire to understand humanity and connect with other human beings that I share this wonderful planet with. And I don't think it's possible to do that without understanding the God and the religion and the philosophy that they worship. So when considering the scale and the scope of Islam in the modern world, 1.8 billion people that have organized their life around this religion, I think it's, a pretty important thing to understand. Now, of this 1.8 billion, they are in ways divided into Sunni and Shia. Now, trying to understand this is like trying to understand global politics without knowing the difference between like Democrats and Republicans in the United States, except the stakes are higher and like the history is even farther back. The truth is, this split happened so early in Islamic history that it's been shaping world events for literal centuries. We're talking 632 AD. To put that in perspective, the divide is older than, the schism between the Roman Catholic Church and, Eastern Orthodox Church or, Protestantism. It predates the Reformation by almost 900 years. But here is where things get interesting, because unlike other religious splits that you might know about, this one didn't start because people disagreed about God or prayer or even major religious teachings. It started because of something far more human in a way and sort of more relatable, kind of a secession problem, a family feud of sorts. The split in Islam happened because after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and just one big old peace be upon him for the rest of the episode, because just for the sake of flowing, I won't say it every time, but shouts out to him. The rest of the Muslims at the time and the other Muslim leadership couldn't agree on who would step in to take the role as their leader. Think about it this way. You know how when a CEO retires, there's drama about who's going to take over the company. Maybe the board wants to vote in one person, but the family thinks that maybe someone else deserves it. Now imagine that company is the fastest growing religion in the world, and the secession fight doesn't just determine who runs things, it shapes the beliefs and, in some ways, the practice of billions of people for the next millennia and a half. And that is exactly what happens when the prophet dies in the year 632 AD. He'd built this incredible movement that had united most of the Arab Peninsula under Islam. People were converting left and right, trade is booming, but then suddenly the leader's gone, and he hadn't exactly left a clear succession plan. Now, Muhammad wasn't just any religious leader. In the early Islamic community, he was everything rolled into one. He was the prophet, a political leader, a military commander that got Mecca and returned the Kaaba back to its proper order. He was a judge. You name it. He was everything to the people in this region at the time. So when he died, it wasn't just who's going to lead the prayers on Friday kind of thing. It was like, who's going to run our entire new civilization and lead us and point us in the right direction? And this is really where our story begins, because the way this problem got answered would create a fault line that still runs through the Middle East today, and it influences global politics and shows up in our news feed in some way or another without us even really knowing it. So the first question you may ask, why didn't Muhammad's children take over when he passed? That's like the most obvious sort of succession, right? The father passes it to the son. So, as we know, Muhammad had 3 sons. He had many children, but specifically 3 sons. And of those 3 sons, they all had passed away prior to the prophet's death. So they couldn't have been there for the succession. So what happens next? Some people thought that the answer was obvious. They thought that Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, should lead. He was family. He was one of the first reverts to Islam. He'd proven himself as a warrior and a loyal companion. From their perspective, leadership should stay in the prophet's bloodline, right? That makes sense. But others disagreed. They thought that the community should choose whoever was most qualified, regardless of family ties. And they believed that Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close friend and father-in-law, was the one that should take over. Abu Bakr was older, a bit more respected, and had been Muhammad's trusted companion from the very beginning. Now, here's a thing that is crucial to understand. Both sides were sincere believers trying to do what they thought the prophet would have wanted. This wasn't good guys versus bad guys. It was more just a really intense family meeting where everyone wants what's best, but they disagree on what exactly that looks like. And so the community ultimately chose Abu Bakr, and that decision split Islam forever. Those who accepted this choice became known as Sunni Muslims, followers of the Sunnah, or tradition of the Prophet. And those that believed Ali should have been, the actual chosen leader, became Shia, literally meaning the party of Ali. At first, you might think, okay, so they disagree about one leadership decision 1,400 years ago, but why does that still matter today? Well, here's the thing about history. Small decisions can have massive consequences, specifically the butterfly and ripple effect as, it goes throughout the years. This wasn't just about who would lead for, a couple years here and there. It was about establishing a precedent for how Islamic leadership would work for generations to come. Because after this new leader, Ali or Abu Bakr, goes and passes on, where does it go from there? Does it continue to go to the most qualified person appointed by the current leader, or does it go to someone in the family line? And this was never officially codified. And that precedent would shape everything: how religious authority works within Islam, who gets to interpret Islamic law as time changes, what the relationship should be between political and religious power, whether leadership comes through bloodline or community election. These are fundamental questions and more, all trace back to the day Islam lost the Prophet, that moment in 632 AD. Now, it's worth stating that the Quran is an inspired holy book that was, basically given to the Prophet by God. It was just spoken specifically by God. It is the holy scripture of the Quran. So this leadership distinction is not necessarily, changing anything about the faith or the religion. It's rather who's going to interpret it for the future. What if something comes along like, AI or some type of weird gambling intermediary thing? Who's going to interpret whether that law is valid for Muslims to practice or not? So today we are going to break down one of the biggest disagreements in modern history, and we'll walk through how a secession dispute became this religion divide and how geography made it even more complicated, and how this ancient split explains some conflicts that are happening right now, not just in the Middle East, but even in your own city. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because I got to tell you a story. Imagine you're sitting in your house. It's cold outside. It's a little snowy, and you're like, man, I just want a panini. So you go and you order it, from DoorDash or something like that. And it never gets to you. You're looking at the app. You're like, dude, it's been 4 hours. Where's my panini? You're calling. No one answers. Well, this is a true story that happened. There was a woman, a client, that was working as a DoorDash driver, and she slipped and fell on an icy walkway outside of a Panera Bread in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She breaks her elbow, which leads to surgery and hardware having to get inserted into her arm. She can't work. And originally, she sues Panera, and Panera was like, okay, we'll give you like $125,000. But then the good people over at Morgan & Morgan fought for her and got her the $1 million verdict that she deserved. Yes. If you've never heard of them, Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. Yes, and they're that way for a reason. They've been fighting for the people for over 35 years. Now, I'll be honest, if I ordered, a panini and the woman gets paid $1 million because she slipped, I mean, it's a tragic thing to happen, of course, but I deserve a little bit of that. I should get a cut at least, right? I'm the one that ordered the panini. If I never ordered that panini, she never would have slipped, never got $1 million, which obviously she deserved. You know what I mean? But maybe next time she gets $1.1 million, I can get a cool 100,000 out of that. Regardless, all I'm saying is if you're ever injured and you are looking to get the money that you deserved, the compensation that is entitled to you from your injuries, Morgan & Morgan could be the way to go. Hiring the wrong law firm can be disastrous. I mean, you can be locked up in litigation. It's a nightmare. But hiring the right law firm could substantially increase your settlement. And with Morgan & Morgan, it's easy to get started. Their fee is $0 unless they win. That's right. Their fee is free unless they win your case. You don't pay you pay 0 cents unless they win your case. You can visit forthepeople.com/Gagnon, Gagnon. That is forthepeople.com/Gagnon, or dial pound law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. That's forthepeople.com/Gagnon, or click the link in the description below. And thank you so much to the good folks over at Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring this program and making this show possible with this paid advertisement. Well, let's get back to the show. So, this feud wasn't just an ordinary disagreement. This is a fight that would basically split the world, and the fastest growing religion forever. So let's look at the moment, all right? June 8th, 632 AD. The Prophet has just died unexpectedly in Medina, which is in modern day Saudi Arabia. No one has ever really confirmed how he passed, just that it followed a brief illness. And some suspect perhaps it was fever. There's even some tradition that he was poisoned by a woman, but even that is disputed as to whether or not that was symbolic or literal. Regardless, the prophet has passed on, and the Islamic community is in shock. This guy had literally united tons of warring tribes across Arabia, created a new civilization, and built a movement that was spreading faster than wildfire. And now he's gone. And suddenly no one knows what happens next, and things, as you can imagine, get messy pretty fast. Muhammad didn't have a son who survived to adulthood, like we said, so he didn't have this direct heir. He also didn't name a different non-familial successor to his line either. So, he never wrote down like, hey, here's who should lead after me or anything like that. And, didn't have a will or any type of clear instruction after his passing. So the community leaders are basically looking at each other like, all right, now what? So within hours, and literally hours, two camps start to form. And this is where you can see how human this whole thing really is. Camp 1 is rallying around Ali. Now, Ali wasn't just a random dude. He and the Prophet were very close. I mean, extremely close. He was Muhammad's first cousin, who he raised in his household like a son. He had also married Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, making him both Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. See, that is, about as close as you can get. The guy had been one of the first people to revert to Islam when he was just a kid. He had also fought alongside Muhammad in every major battle, and by all accounts proved himself to be a warrior and a leader. So to Ali's supporters, the choice is pretty obvious, right? Keep it in the family. Muhammad had clearly loved and trusted this guy. Plus, there's something that just kind of feels right to people about bloodline succession. It's just kind of intuitive. It's straightforward. And it's how most societies worked for, thousands of years, specifically back then. And it's honestly how a lot of them still work today. But here's the thing. While Ali's people were making their case, another group is moving fast. And Camp 2 is meeting in something called the Saqifa. And this is basically a covered area where the local Medina tribes used to kind of discuss and hash out their business. And they're not talking about Ali at all. They're talking about Abu Bakr. Now, Abu Bakr was completely different in terms of candidacy. He was Muhammad's closest friend, his father-in-law, and one of his most trusted advisors. This was the guy Muhammad had chosen to lead prayers when he was too sick to do it himself. Abu Bakr was a bit older. He was experienced. He'd also been there from day one of this Islamic movement. And here's where it gets interesting from a political perspective. Both sides had really good points in favor of their candidates. The Ali supporters, Camp 1 would say, look, trusted family, gave Ali special responsibilities. There's wisdom in keeping leadership in the bloodline, and it provides continuity, legitimacy. Bang. Camp 2 just had a different view for what the qualifications should be. The Abu Bakr supporters would say, look, this isn't a kingdom. We don't do hereditary rule here. We choose our leaders based on who's most qualified, who the community trusts, who can actually do the job the best, and we choose leaders not on birth or, who their dad was. We choose them based on merit and how good they are at leading our caliphate. So neither side was wrong exactly. They just had different ideas about how leadership should work. And, it's a reasonable thing. You could imagine like a kingdom in England, right? And being like, all right, the king is dead. Do we bring in, his son, or do we elect like a really competent general that understands how to do politics? It's like, look, both of them could work. But as with everything in life, timing is what matters. And Abu Bakr, that is Camp 2, they moved faster. While some of Ali's supporters were still dealing with Muhammad's funeral arrangements, the Saqifa happened quickly. And Abu Bakr got chosen as the first caliph, literally meaning the successor. Ali's people felt blindsided. They thought this was supposed to be a community decision, but it felt more like a sneaky political maneuver. Imagine showing up to a family meeting about your grandfather's will, only to find out that your cousins already had a meeting yesterday and divided up everything without you. And you would probably feel a little bit annoyed. Now, here's what's crucial to understand. While his supporters were furious for sure, Ali himself didn't start a war over this. He was upset, sure. But Ali eventually, after about 6 months, publicly accepted Abu Bakr's leadership for the sake of unity, which is, in all fairness, a pretty humble move, to be honest. And this is a good time to remember that these weren't just political factions. They were sincere people. They were united by a faith, by a belief in Allah, trying to figure out what was best for their communities. And Ali could have split the Islamic world right there, 632, bang, and just created a whole new faction that went to war. Instead, he chose unity over what he, could have insisted was a personal claim to leadership. But the people who had supported him, they didn't move on as easily. They became known as Shiat Ali, the party of Ali, or just Shia for short. The people who had supported the community's choice of Abu Bakr became Sunni because they followed the Sunnah, or the traditional way. And right there, in those first few months after the Prophet's death, you have the Great Divide. The Sunni precedent was the community chooses its leaders based on qualifications and consensus. And the Shia precedent was leadership should stay within the Prophet's family line, and Ali was robbed of this rightful position. Some in the Shia camp have even suggested that there is some hadith that actually corroborate with the idea that Ali should actually be the successor. So it is said in the event of Ghadir Qum, where he reportedly said, whoever's mullah, which is the leader or the protector, I am, Ali is his mullah. Now, that basically means, whoever I am protecting or leading, Ali is also leading. Now, some people argue that this is more spiritual guidance and not necessarily a political appointment, but still, this just contributes to the rift. Now, as we can imagine, it doesn't end there, and things just only continue to get more political. Remember how Ali eventually accepted Abu Bakr's leadership for the sake of unity? Well, that unity didn't last long. After Abu Bakr died, the leadership passed to Umar and then to Uthman. And Ali's supporters kept on waiting for their guy to get his turn. And then finally, in 656 AD, 24 years after the Prophet's death, Ali was effectively appointed to become the fourth caliph. But by then, the damage was done. Those 2 decades of waiting had created a lot of resentment between these two factions. So when Ali eventually did become the leader, he faced immediate challenges to his authority. There were civil wars and political assassinations, and eventually Ali himself was murdered in 661 AD. And here's where the story takes a dark turn that would kind of change everything that followed. After Ali's death, his son, Hussein, Muhammad's grandson, tried to claim leadership. Once again, you have the succession problem. You have Ali's side saying it should stay in the family, and you have Abu Bakr's side saying it should be the most competent person. But the political winds had shifted. The Sunni establishment was firmly in control, and they weren't about to hand power back to Ali's family, because again, this would just create precedent to keep it in the family forever. So in 680 AD, Hussein and a small group of followers were surrounded by a much larger Sunni army at a place called Karbala, in what is now modern-day Iraq. Hussein was killed, along with most of his companions. For Shia Muslims, this wasn't just a political defeat, it was martyrdom that would come to define their entire identity. Think about how Christians remember the crucifixion, or how Americans remember September the 11th. For Shias, Karbala became that kind of defining moment. It proved in their minds that the rightful leaders of Islam, the Prophet's own family, had been persecuted and murdered by people that they saw as illegitimate, you could say. So when you believe your leaders were divinely chosen, that kind of changes how you think about leadership and how strongly you feel about the person in charge. And then when they're, murdered by their enemies, it changes how severely you might respond. So Shias believed that the idea that only certain people, descendants of Muhammad's daughter Fatima, could be the true leaders of the religion. They were the ones who were chosen. They were divinely guided. They had been inspired by God. They were these leaders, the imams. That is who God has called. Now, the Sunni looked at this and said, whoa. That's not how this works. From their perspective, religious authority comes from scholarship and community consensus and following the traditions that Muhammad had established. You don't need to be a part of a special bloodline for access to God. That's not how Allah works. You need to study the Quran. You need to understand Islamic law. You need to have the community trust. And that being said, the Sunnis didn't believe in the same kind of divine ordination of the, caliph as the Shias. So it just, again, comes down to this fundamental disagreement. And in my opinion, both sides could work. It's just a matter of which one did. Not to mention these Sunnis are saying, well, we already established that Abu Bakr is the person that's going to take over. So it's going to be the, person that the community chooses next. Shias believed in this unbroken chain of divinely guided leaders, starting with the Prophet. So, Sunnis believe in this collective scholarship and community decision-making, starting with the Prophet, but not necessarily biologically linked. Now, this single difference in religious authority would lead to all the other differences too. So if you walk into a Shia mosque during prayer time, you might notice something different. For many Shia Muslims, they place their foreheads on small clay tablets when they prostrate during prayer. These tablets, called turba, are often made from clay from holy sites like Karbala, where Hussein was killed. Sunnis usually use prayer rugs or pray directly on clean ground. To them, the clay tablets are maybe unnecessary. God doesn't care what your forehead touches as long as your heart is pure. It's not a huge difference, but it's visible. It's like how some Christian denominations use different types of communion bread, or what communion means to them, or how some Jewish communities will wear different styles of head covering. Some, they have the same core faith, but it manifests into slightly different practices that means different things to the descendants of that specific, subset. So the calendar differences are even more directly linked to the conflict that started. So, for example, Shias have holidays that Sunnis don't really observe, and vice versa. The biggest one for Shias is Ashura. And this is the day of mourning that commemorates Hussein's death at Karbala. You'll see processions and ritual reenactments of the battle, and sometimes even self-flagellation as people express their grief over this 1,300-year-old tragedy. Sunnis acknowledge Ashura too, but for them, it's more about fasting and remembering Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Same day, just completely different focus. Or take Ghadir Kum. This is when Shias celebrate the day that Muhammad supposedly designated Ali as his successor. This is the quote that I had read earlier. This is obviously a big deal for Shias as it validates their entire historical narrative. It's, their whole thing in a way. Sunnis, however, either interpret Muhammad's words from this day differently, or they just don't see it as a clear secession as Shias do. They see it, again, as this sort of spiritual guidance, not literally the political appointment as the caliph. These holidays aren't just different events on the calendar. They're different ways of people remembering history and different stories about what actually happened in that history and different interpretations of what it all means in the first place. And the thing is, these differences didn't happen overnight. We're talking about centuries of development where each community refined their beliefs and their practices in response to their experiences. So Shias obviously leaned into their theology of divine leadership, partially because their leaders were, getting killed or marginalized, and Sunnis developed their emphasis on community consensus, partially because, that's just how they had been making decisions since Abu Bakr. Each side, I think you could say, was doing their best based off what they thought was right, responding authentically to their own history, their own challenges, and their own understanding of what the Prophet really intended. And over time, those responses became traditions, then doctrines, then distinct religious identities. But even with all these theological developments, the split was still manageable, right? Sunnis and Shias still lived together, and they traded together, and sometimes even ruled over each other without major conflicts because they both just accepted, that's Allah. We have to honor the one singular monotheistic God, and that is Allah. And we all have great respect and reverence for the Prophet, and we all read the Quran, and that's all that matters. But the growing conflict was never just about theology. There's an element that would really change this entire game, which, in my opinion, is the biggest X factor that kind of dictates all of geopolitics, and that is geography. Here's something that might shock you. About 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide are Sunni, while only 10 to 15% are Shia. So if you're doing the math, that's roughly 1.5 billion Sunnis and maybe 200 million Shias on the entire planet. And these numbers explain why certain countries dominate the headlines more than others. Now, if you only knew these numbers with no other context, you would expect that Sunni Muslims are going to dominate the news, right? After all, they are the overwhelming majority. But that's not what happens. Turn on any news channel and you hear about, Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah, countries and organizations connected to Shia Islam. Way more than you would expect for a group that's only 10% of the entire religion. So what is that about? And like most things, it is about location. Now, here's the thing about those 200 million Shia Muslims. They didn't spread out across the globe. Instead, they stuck together and ended up concentrating in some of the most strategically important real estate on Earth. Let's start with the big one, Iran. Today, Iran is about 90% Shia, making it the undisputed center of Shia Islam in the world. But here's what's wild. Iran wasn't always Shia. For the first 900 years of Islamic history, Iran was mostly Sunni. This change happened in 1501 when a dynasty called the Safavids came to power in Iran. These guys made a calculated political decision, and they declared Shia Islam the official state religion. Why? Because it gave them a way to distinguish themselves from their enemies, the Ottoman Empire to the west and the various Sunni kingdoms that live around them. And it's brilliant, actually. Instead of just being another Muslim empire, Iran chose to become the defenders of Shia Islam, despite the majority in their country at the time. It gave them a unique identity and a way to influence Shia communities in other countries. Think of it like how the Soviet Union kind of used communism and the communist ideology to build alliances in the Cold War. But the Safavids didn't just declare Iran is Shia and call it a day. They forced the conversion. Sunni scholars were exiled or executed. Shia clerics were brought in from other regions. And it took a couple centuries, but Iran eventually transformed from a Sunni majority country to a Shia heartland that we know today. Then you've got Iraq. Iraq is basically ground zero for the entire split, right? Like, remember Karbala, where Hussein was killed? That's in Iraq. And all the other most holy sites in Shia Islam, like Najaf, Karbala, Kadhimiya, they're all in Iraq too. So Iraq is like this hotbed for holy sites and just sort of piety in Shia tradition. But here's where it gets complicated. Iraq's population is roughly 60% Shia and 35% Sunni. And yet, for most of modern Iraqi history, Sunnis were in charge, even though they were the minority. Under the Ottoman Empire, the Sunni elites ran the show. Under British rule, they kept the same power structure. And then a man named Saddam Hussein came along. You might have heard of him. He was Sunni, and he ruled over the Shia majority country for decades. So when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 and removed Saddam, they didn't just change one dictator for another, they flipped the entire power structure of the country. Suddenly, the Shia majority could actually rule, and that sent shockwaves throughout the entire Middle East. Saudi Arabia, the Sunni powerhouse, suddenly had a Shia-dominated government right next door. Iran, the Shia powerhouse, suddenly had much more influence over Iraqi politics since they were now Shia as well. It's as like if Mexico suddenly became like a Chinese ally, it would change North American politics completely because now America has to be concerned about Mexico for, spycraft and invasion and war, whereas right now we don't have to be. So speaking of Saudi Arabia, here's another number that matters. Saudi Arabia is about 85% Sunni. Now here's the kicker. Most of their oil happens to be located in the eastern province. And guess who lives there? That's right, the Shia minority. Just like 10 to 15% of the Saudi Arabian population. So you can see how this is just causing all sorts of political turmoil. You've got the situation where Saudi Arabia and their economy in many ways depends on oil that's extracted from areas where their religious minorities live. And those minorities look across the Persian Gulf at Iran and see a country where their like-minded Shia buddies are in charge. And then you have smaller players that punch above their weight. So for example, Bahrain, majority Shia, about 60%, but ruled by a Sunni royal family. It's also home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is, strategically crucial to the United States and our geopolitical interests. Azerbaijan, 85% Shia, and it sits right between Iran and Russia with significant oil and gas reserves. You start to see the pattern here, right? It's not just that Shias are concentrated geographically, it's that they're concentrated in places that matter enormously for global energy, trade routes, regional power, all that. I mean, imagine this. Imagine if 90% of Christians were Catholic. But all the Protestants happen to live in Texas and Alaska and North Sea oil fields. And even though they'd be a small minority globally, they'd have outsized influence because of where they are and the fact that they live on the most valuable land in the world. That's basically the situation with the Sunni Shia demographics. Numbers don't tell the whole story, and geography actually gives the minority super strategic advantages. And you didn't think this was possible, but this is where it gets even more interesting and even more complicated. These geographical concentrations aren't just about modern geopolitics. They create natural alliance systems that cross national borders. Like Iran doesn't just care about the Shias in their own country. They see themselves as protectors of Shias everywhere, like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. Wherever you have Shias, Iran is the protector. It's kind of like how Israel sees itself connected to Jewish communities worldwide. Their ethnicity is stronger it's like a stronger bond to them than their actual nationality necessarily. Like being Shia is more important to them in some ways than being, Iranian, for example. Saudi Arabia plays the same game from the Sunni side. They fund mosques and religious schools around the Sunni world. They position themselves as the guardians of Islam's holiest site, obviously in Mecca and Medina. Like, you know how when Muslims pray around the globe, they always try to pray facing the direction of Mecca, right? In case you didn't know, that is in Saudi Arabia. So what you end up with here in this situation where, local conflicts become proxy wars between regional powers. When there's fighting in Syria, it's not just about Syria. You have Iran backing Shia allied governments while Saudi Arabia and other Sunni powers back the opposition. And when there's conflict in Yemen, there's the same dynamic. So what's so crazy about this is a lot of these conflicts aren't actually centered around religious differences at all. They're usually more about the bigger guys, Iran and Saudi Arabia, competing for regional influence, using their religious identity as a way to sort of build coalitions and, kind of justify their involvement with the region. I'm trying to think. I think literally Saddam, as a Sunni leader over a Shia country, was extremely concerned with Iran because they are a Shia nationalist country. And he thought, oh, wow, the, Ayatollah that now is in Iran is able to control my people more than me. Even though I'm the, sovereign leader over all these people, I'm Sunni, they might listen to him before they listen to me. You have a massive power struggle on your hands. So it's actually beyond religion. It's just power. It's like the Cold War in a way, except instead of, capitalism versus communism, it's kind of Sunni versus Shia. And just like the Cold War, the ideological labels often kind of mask what's really going on, right? Like is Cuba necessarily like, oh, we're the most communist ever, or were they just trying to get protection from this massive Cold War entity and Fidel was able to strike up a deal? But what makes things even more complex than the Cold War, unlike, Americans and Soviets, Iranians and Saudis actually do share a religion and a prophet and a god and a holy book, which means this competition is happening within this family of believers, not between enemies or even strangers. These are people that both study the Quran and the Hadiths at length their entire lives. And that creates all kinds of complications for how the rest of the world, outside looking in, tries to understand what's actually going on. So here's a question that might blow your mind. If this Sunni-Shia divide is such a big deal, why did nobody in the United States really talk about it before, like, the 1980s? I mean, like, go back and read newspapers from the 60s and 70s about the Middle East. You'll see stuff about, like, Arab nationalism and socialism, oil politics, like Cold War proxy stuff, Israel, of course, but sectarian violence barely got talked about. I mean, the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s was like the first time that Western media really started to even examine this Sunni versus Shia disparity. And now those words are thrown around all the time as if that's like an explanation for all the problems. Here's what the media won't necessarily explain. Most Sunni and Shia Muslims get along fine in their daily lives. No one in the media was really emphasizing the divide because there really didn't seem to be a massive one. Take Lebanon, for example. You know how the news is always talking about, Lebanese sectarian tensions. Here's what they don't say. Sunni and Shia families live in the same street and kids go to the same schools and people work in the same offices. And the Muslim community in Lebanon had to share space with Lebanese Christians and Druze and Maronites. And for a long time, they all largely coexisted successfully. And it wasn't until the Civil War started in Lebanon in the late 1970s that the factions started to matter. And of course, everything changed. Or, pre-2003 Iraq, right? This is Saddam Hussein territory. And he was a brutal dictator, but Iraqi society wasn't walking around in constant religious warfare. Sunni and Shias intermarried. Some of the most famous Iraqi families had both Sunni and Shia branches. Neighborhoods were mixed. A country that is, predominantly Shia had a Sunni guy leading the show. The guy fixing your car might be Sunni. The woman running the grocery store might be Shia. No one really cared on a day-to-day basis. In fact, here's something that might surprise you. The rest of extreme sectarian identity as we know it in Iraq actually happened after the U.S. invasion, not before. When the old government collapsed and the Civil War broke out, people started identifying more strongly along these religious lines because it became like a way to find protection and organize politically in a moment of extreme national chaos. Now, to be clear, it's not that Sunni or Shia identities were not important to the people before. It's just that they weren't as big of a deal, and they weren't as divisive as they had become after the conflicts in their country kind of made them feel like they needed to band together, and obviously for the protection of their communities and, their faith. It's like how America didn't really think of themselves as like Northern or Southern until the Civil War broke out and then people had to pick sides. And even to this day, people identify as, oh, I'm a Southerner or I'm a Northerner. And that conflict obviously reinforces the identity of how, the identity contributed to the conflict, and it creates kind of a flywheel. And this pattern seems to repeat everywhere. In Syria, before the Civil War, you had Sunni majority cities within Shia neighborhoods, mixed marriages, shared business partnerships, and the sectarian violence you see there now that is largely a product of war. But here's the thing about media coverage. Conflict sells and coexistence doesn't. Sunni and Shia neighbors share tea and complain about traffic. That's not going to make anyone click on your, website or sell a newspaper, right? But you say like, oh, Sunni versus Shia, beef, gang war, like that is going to sell tickets, right? It's like assuming that all Protestants and Catholics hate each other because of what happened in Northern Ireland. Yeah, of course, there are serious religious conflicts there, but that doesn't mean that Protestant and Catholic Americans aren't friends or that German Protestants and Italian Catholics are automatically enemies. And also it fails to remind us of how much Protestants and Catholics actually share, similar to how, Sunnis and Shias share so much in their tradition and in their faith. The Northern Ireland comparison, I think, is kind of perfect in a way because it shows how religious labels can mask political conflicts, right? Like the Troubles weren't really about transubstantiation or papal authority or the divinity of, the Virgin Mary or like any of the things that would that Luther would talk about in the Reformation, right? It's about political representation, economic opportunity, national identity, alliances with Britain. Like religion was the team jersey, but the game was actually about power. So the same thing happens in the Middle East. Many of these sectarian wars are really about countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia competing for regional influence. And they, in certain ways, utilize the religious identity to build coalitions and justify that involvement. But the underlying competition is just classic geopolitics. I mean, look at Yemen, right? The media often frames it as Iranian-backed Shia rebels versus Saudi-backed Sunni government. But the Houthis and the so-called Shia rebels that we're talking about are actually from a Shia sect that's pretty different from Iranian Shias. Their grievances are mostly about political representation and economic marginalization, not theological differences with Sunnis. So Iran started supporting them not because of this deep religious solidarity, but because backing the Houthis gave Iran a way to pressure Saudi Arabia and tie down Saudi military resources. This is a strategic move, not a spiritual move that people, imams are going through the Quran and saying like, we need to, teach the, Islamic interpretation of the Quran or hadiths in this way. It's like, hey, we're going to put pressure on this government. Syria, same exact thing. Bashar al-Assad isn't even technically Shia. He's Alawite, which is a whole different branch of Islam that some Muslims don't even consider Islamic. That's a whole other thing we'll get into a different day. But Iran supports him not because of religious kinship, but because Syria is their pathway to influence Lebanon and their main ally in the region. So let's just take a break for a sec, right? I know that was a lot of political and religious context that we just kind of dove into. I kind of feel like I need to get like a cork board with like pins or something just to make this make sense. But it's not a conspiracy, but it is complicated. What's sad about all of this, though, is that the average Muslim family that lives in, your neighborhood is way more worried about their kids' grades and paying bills than they are theological differences from, 1400 years ago. Just like the average American Christian family cares more about their mortgage than they care about like the 30 Years' War or whatever. So here's a reality check from personal experience. I've been to a few Muslim countries in my time. And you know what people actually argue about? Soccer, politics, shawarma, hummus, stuff like whether their kids should be a doctor, go to, be a lawyer, things like that, human stuff. Yes, religious identity obviously matters. I'm not downplaying that at all. It influences how people vote, how they, form their culture and, who they might want to marry, which holidays. But the separation between the Sunni and the Shia It's not this all-encompassing, all-consuming tribal warfare that the news often tries to make it seem like. The thing is, when conflicts do break out, whether it's Iraq, Syria, Yemen, religious differences become a convenient way to organize sides and motivate fighters and apply pressure on different governments. And different governments will use these things as ways to push other governments. But suddenly, these century-old theological disputes become rallying cries and scapegoats for modern political battles. And the media loves the, ancient religious hatred because it's simple and it kind of explains everything in like a very clean way. Sunni, Shia, it sounds like this exotic, fundamental, rift rather than like regional powers competing for influence using religious identity as a mobilization tool. That's much more boring. But the simple story isn't the true story. The true story is a bit messier and more human and honestly, in some ways, more optimistic, because if these conflicts were really about irreconcilable religious differences going back 1,400 years, then there would be no hope for establishing peace. But if they're mostly about politics and power and resources and governments at the very top that are mostly concerned with power, well, then those are human problems that human beings have figured out how to solve before. The tragedy is that when political conflicts get wrapped up in religious identity, they become way harder to parse. Because now you're not just arguing politics, you're arguing about who represents the true faith, who is truly betraying their ancestors, and who does Allah really support. It's kind of like how, family business, you get into it with like a colleague. You're not just disagreeing, having like this professional disagreement. It's like you are arguing with your sister and your sister that you grew up with. And this is your sister that you've known, and she always would do that thing that you knew that it's like way more personal. And that's definitely part of what makes the 7th century secession dispute into a 21st century geopolitical mess. So understanding the root of this split and why it happened is definitely key to understanding why the Middle East looks the way it does, at least insofar as its Muslim population. We're not even getting into other faiths in the region or Wahhabism or anything like that. But the initial split in Islam does help us better understand modern day issues and also how they're intertwined with the religion. And it kind of contextualizes the geopolitics of today. So let's just take a look at how some of these geopolitical games are playing out today. Take Syria. Civil war starts in 2011. It wasn't initially this sectarian conflict. People were protesting against Bashar al-Assad and his dictatorial regime, demanding political reforms and economic opportunities for the people. The protesters included Sunnis, Christians, Alawites, Kurds, basically everyone who was fed up with the government. But then the regional powers got involved. Iran looked at Syria and thought, Assad is our ally. This is our pathway to influence Lebanon, our connection to Hezbollah. We can't let them fall. So Iran started to pour money and weapons and eventually military advisors into Syria. Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states looked at this and they thought, this is our chance to weaken Iran's influence and maybe get Sunni-friendly government in Damascus. So they start to fund rebel groups. Suddenly, a protest movement about jobs and political freedom becomes this proxy war between Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. The religious labels become ways to organize internal and international support, even though that's not necessarily the cause of the conflict. We see this pattern also appear in Yemen. The Houthis, who are from a Shia minority in Yemen, started the rebellion because they felt marginalized by the Sunni majority. They had legitimate grievances about political representation, economic development, things that you see from minority groups in any nation. But when Iran saw the opportunity to pressure Saudi Arabia by supporting the Houthis, and Saudi Arabia saw an Iranian-backed group taking over their neighbor as this existential threat, now you have what looks like sectarian warfare. But again, it's really more about these two superpowers in the region using Yemen as a battlefield. Iraq is probably the clearest example, right? The U.S. removed Saddam in 2003. Iraq's new Shia majority government develops closer ties with Iran. They share a border, they share a religion, and a history of oppression under Sunni rule. Saudi Arabia and other Sunni powers looked at this, and they obviously get a little freaked out. We can't have Iranian influence directly next door sharing this massive border. So they started to support Sunni groups in Iraq, including some that became pretty extremist. And then there's Turkey. Turkey is overwhelmingly Sunni, so you'd expect them to automatically side with Saudi Arabia, right? Two Sunni countries, bang. Nope. In Syria, Turkey has often been at odds with Saudi policy because Turkey has its own interests, controlling Kurdish groups on its border, maintaining influence in former Ottoman territories and, managing refugees. Or look at Pakistan. Pakistan is mostly Sunni. but they maintain decent relations with Iran because they share a border and they need to manage their own Shia minority. Geography and economics almost always matter more than theology in these cases. And the result of all this is, it makes the Middle East appear like this picture of ancient sectarian hatred, and no one can agree about, the very secession of the prophet. But on the other hand, it's actually this messy tapestry of modern power and competition playing out through local proxies. So when you read, you have Sunni versus Shia violence, just ask yourself, what are the strategic interests at play and who benefits from framing this as a religious conflict? And this framework explains why the 2003 Iraq invasion was such a game changer. It didn't just remove one dictator, it flipped the regional balance of power. Suddenly Iran had more influence over Iraq, which changed everything about how the regional powers calculated their interests. It also explains why the Arab Spring was so destabilizing. When governments started falling in 2011, Iran and Saudi Arabia both saw opportunities to expand their influence and, threats to their existing allies. So what started as these, democratic movements got sucked into these larger regional competitions. It even explains some of the weird dynamics in places like Lebanon, where Hezbollah, a Shia militia backed by Iran, provides social services and fights Israeli forces, but also acts as Iran's proxy in regional conflicts. Now, I know that all of this is a lot, and we'll do a deep dive on, the different independent religious militia groups throughout the Middle East sometime. But here's the thing that is both kind of depressing, but sort of optimistic about the entire thing. It's depressing because it means that a lot of people are dying in conflicts that really aren't about their local grievances, right? Syrians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Iraqis, they're paying the price for these regional power struggles and proxy wars. But it's also hopeful because it means that these conflicts aren't fundamental. They're not necessarily only about irreconcilable religious differences, which means that hopefully one day they could be resolved through political solutions or governance or inclusive institutions, negotiating power sharing, things like that. But that is more or less the real story as I understand it. So the next time you see these headlines, you'll look for the strategic interests behind all of these religious labels, and you'll understand why this 1,400-year-old, family feud still shapes the world today. So there you have it, the Sunni-Shia split, explained without, hopefully, too much academic jargon. I tried my best. What started as a family argument about leadership became different religious traditions and now is used as, political tools by competing powers and proxy wars. And the religious differences are real, sure. Shias do have different beliefs about leadership and authority than Sunnis, but notice how these differences develop in response to these political events. And this is why context matters, right? The next time you see these headlines, just, again, know that there's probably more going on below the surface. And remember, at the end of the day, they're both Muslim, and they mostly get along in real life, and the conflicts you hear about are usually more about politics than they are about prayer. Some of the most effective peacemakers in the Middle East have actually been people who understand both sides of this divide, and they can speak to religious concerns while addressing these underlying political issues. They know that you can't solve these problems by ignoring the religious dimensions, but you also can't solve them by treating religion as the only dimension. So now, you're officially smarter than your uncle who tries to explain Middle Eastern politics at, Thanksgiving. And hopefully you can kind of help change how people see these things in your circle, specifically people that maybe are not Muslim or don't understand the differences of how these two groups actually interact. At the end of the day, both these groups both read the same Quran. They both believe in the Prophet Muhammad, and they believe that that is God's final prophet. Both follow the 5 pillars of Islam: faith, prayer, charity, fasting, pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. And this 1,400-year-old feud doesn't necessarily have to define the next 1,400 years, and understanding it hopefully is a step towards moving beyond. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is basically, as I understand it, the divide between the Sunni and the Shia. Thank you guys so much for joining us for another episode of Religion Camp. I appreciate you guys so much. Like I said, I did not grow up Muslim. I did not grow up with this faith tradition. This is just a compiled research from myself and a few friends to try to understand really what this is for the average person. So if there's anything I missed, please drop a comment. If there's anything that was oversimplified or that I got wrong, please let me know. I read all the comments on YouTube and Spotify, and I look forward to seeing what you guys say. And if you didn't grow up Muslim or didn't know much about this religious divide and how it sort of developed into proxy conflicts, I'd love to know what you think. Like, is this new to you? Does this make a lot of sense? Does the, Irish troubles and the religious warfare that existed in that region, does that map for you? Drop a comment. I read all of them. And just please be nice. This is religion camp. All right. After all. Religion is the nicest thing ever, right? No one's ever fought over religion, right? Anyway, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys joining us for another episode of Religion Camp. We drop these episodes every Sunday, and we will see you next week. So long, and peace be with you. If you've made it to the end of this episode, you are clearly someone who understands that beneath every historical event lies a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered. You're the type of person who knows that real history is more fascinating than any fiction, and we deeply appreciate that about you. I'll be honest. That's exactly why I personally invite you to sign up for Today in History, our free newsletter that goes beyond the surface of historical events. We dive into the stories that textbooks never told you, the secrets that challenge the course of nations, and the forgotten tales that deserve to be remembered. Let's continue this journey of discovery together. Take the conversation from your headphones into your inbox. Sign up now through the QR code or link in the description. Today in History, because every day holds a secret waiting to be revealed. Thank you for being part of our historical journey, and we'll see you next time.